Welcome to Cashman's Garage. I'm Justin, and today we're going to be working on a 2014 Nissan Sentra, and we're going to be installing a hub assembly and a driver's side axle. Should be a lot of fun. Let's get started. So our first step, we're going to jack the car up by the pinch weld, add a jack stand for safety, and pop off all 5 of these lug nuts. Really nothing to it. So now that we have the wheel off, our next step is to pull out this cotter pin, take off this little star cap here, and then we have our axle nut behind it. Then we're going to take that off with an impact driver. Now that we got that cotter pin and that little castle thing off, we pop on our 32 millimeter and our gun and crank that loose. There's a washer behind it. If you have a hard time getting that out, it should slide out when you're pulling all of this apart. Let's move forward. Alright, so typically, if I was just doing an axle, my next step, I would take off these 2 strut bolts just to see if I have enough clearance to get this thing pushed out of here. But today we're also doing a hub assembly, so I'm going to have to take off the brakes. So instead of taking off our caliper itself, I usually go straight to the back on the bracket. You got 2 bolts, they're 19 millimeters, one on the top, one on the bottom. Kind of hard to stretch it, but I have several other videos, you could check it out. It's right there. So, if they don't come out easy, hit them with some PB Blaster, take a 15-minute break. I usually use a deep socket. This way we're not banging into this stuff here. And kind of a less expensive ratchet that I don't feel bad smacking with a hammer to break these loose. Once those are off, you're going to want to have a jack stand or something so that you can lean this caliper on it. Otherwise, you put a lot of tension on this hose, could cause a leak, just a lot of problems, and you want to get it out of the way. So, that's what we're going to do next. When you're doing this, make sure that that socket's on nice and straight. Otherwise, you really run a chance of rounding it out, and that would make the rest of this a nightmare. So I'm getting this last mounting bolt from the bottom. So we got our 2 there. And then this little guy should just slide up pretty easy. If it doesn't, you might have a caliper issue. But that's something we're not looking at today. But you see how I put this on the jack stand? So we got no tension on here. That's the most important thing. Then we got a rotor. We might have to take a rubber mallet and tap this from behind. But there's really nothing holding this on. We're going to take some PB Blaster, spray it in here, and all our little crevices. And then worst case, we might have to bring out the trusted MAP gas torch. So let's cross fingers. That went really, really easy. I just soaked this top hat in PB Blaster, gave her 2 smacks, came right loose, and that guy just comes right off. So now we're looking at the hub that we're replacing, and as you can see behind here, you can see the thread of the 4 bolts that we're going to be pushing out, which is our next step. And what I like to do, take some more of this PB Blaster and soak them. Soak them, walk away for about 15 minutes. Just take a small break and make sure that you get this exposed thread here. Otherwise, you're going to have a hell of a time getting them out. It's going to make it 100 times easier. So I'm going to spray these down, and then we'll get to the back side and see how to get to our bolts. So I've decided that to give us a little bit more room back here, and because we have to do the axle anyway, I'm going to undo these top 2 bolts, which attach our strut to our spindle. This is going to allow me to get enough room to push this whole piece forward, and I might be able to wiggle this axle out without doing the tie rod end. We cross fingers. Okay, so that went very easy. 21mm box end on the bolt side, 21mm socket on the other. Used an impact gun to just drive her right out. Now, they were nice and free. They came out super clean, but I've been in a million circumstances where that's not the case, so you might want to give it a tap with a brass hammer, something soft so you don't mess up the threads. And then this guy should just wiggle forward, and that went way easier than usual. Now I notice here that we got a little ABS wire, and it hangs in just with a little bit of pressure. We can wiggle that out, and this way we're not putting tension on that line. Now that we can move this forward, we're going to have a little more room. We're going to try to push this axle through. We might have to give this a tap with the hammer. And worst case, you might have somebody go in and actually turn the steering wheel. And if we can wiggle this guy out, we'll have much easier access to the 4 bolts holding this hub together. As you can see here, I managed to push it all the way through, out and around. We're halfway to getting this axle out. But we still have these 4 bolts back here that we have to take off. Now that we have a lot of room, I may just take an impact gun and drive these guys out of here. Let's continue forward. So, with the axle out of the way, it's still hooked up back here by the transmission, but we have a lot more room back here to get at those 4 bolts. Now, in order to get a little more leverage, and so that we're not putting too much stress on our tie rod end here, we're going to go right back up to the top, and we're going to throw these bolts back in, just temporarily, so that we can get some leverage and twist these guys out. Alright, little perseverance, a lot of PB blaster. Got these guys right out. Now remember, I reattached these on the top to give us a little more leverage from behind, so that we're not fighting our tie rod end. So now that all 4 of those guys are out, I went ahead and I attached my slide hammer. And the way that this works, you're just going to want to use a couple lug nuts, 1 on the top, or 1 on the bottom, 2 on the top. You're going to want to make sure that you use an adapter that sits nice and flush and even. And then by ramming this backwards, we are going to actually pull this hub out. And there she goes. So now that our hub is out, you can see all the nasty rust that was kind of holding this guy together. So what we're going to do is we're going to take some emery cloth or some fine sandpaper and just clean this all up. We're going to add a layer of anti-seize so that the new one goes in nice and smooth. And it looks like this guy here. Sometimes you get a lot of metallic bits. You might want to clean that off and wipe it down. That's going to be the tip for your ABS sensor. And you can see here, I mean, this thing is just gobbled up with nastiness. So we're going to clean everything, add some anti-seize so that our hub is ready to go. And then we're going to go into the back here and figure out how to yank this, this axle out. I have a feeling we'll be using our trusty slide hammer again. So now that our surface is nice and clean, we got some anti-seize on there, and we wiped down our sensor, we're going to take these 2 bolts back out, the ones that hold the strut to your spindle, and we're going to kind of move things around so that we can get a little more room to yank that axle out nice and straight. You can kind of see in the background there. Now this thing, if you're wondering why we're replacing it, all that goop is CV boot grease that got sprayed out when that boot ripped. So these are just held in by a little C-clip at the end of the axle, and sometimes it takes a little effort to get them out. It's going to work kind of the same way as the hub assembly that we just did. we're just going to want to apply even pressure around the entire circle and pull it flat and straight and with a little bit of impact. So let's go forward. So usually the first thing that I do when trying to take out one of these axles is I give it a little bit of a yank, just straight back, just to see how the rigidity of this boot is. And I had a feeling this guy was not going to hold up. So we got most of our axle out. Now we just got to get our inner CV. Now, this typically causes a bunch of grease to spill out. So I'm usually prepared and I throw a big towel down there. But today there was no grease left in it. So it's going to be a little cleaner than usual. But now that we have our boot off, we can kind of look for a couple grooves, something to attach our slide hammer onto. That's what we're going to do next. So this may be a little hard to see here, but what I did, I took a 3-jaw puller and attached it to my slide hammer. And then I used this little round black piece here, and I twisted this to tighten up all 3 of the jaws on the puller. And this is going to work in the same way that we did the hub. We're going to ram this thing back. Now, it's pretty much sticking on that boot. There's a really good chance that boot's going to come off with it. But I got it really tight, so hopefully on the first pull we could yank it out like this. Otherwise, you're going to try to find some grooves on the end of the CV shaft there anyway, and use those grooves, try to get a bite on this thing, and yank it out even. This is usually the most trying part of doing one of these. But once you have it out, the rest is fairly simple. So, like I said, that usually doesn't work, but it's worth a shot, and if it doesn't work, it gets the boot off nice and easy. So, as you can see with that boot off, I have a little bit of a groove here. I actually have one on all 3 raised sections. Point, here we go. All 3 raised sections. And that's going to give me enough grab. Make sure it's nice and tight, pull it out straight. So I probably should have mentioned, this thing might dump a bunch of transmission fluid. You should probably have a pan ready to go. I did not. Usually on the other past cars I've done, haven't seen that much flow out of it. So we're going to have to go pick up some transmission fluid. But as long as I have these out, I want to do some comparison. Make sure, first off, that they're about the same length. Looks like our new guy, they don't put this little rubber bushing here, but it doesn't look like it's going to affect anything. And then I'm going to come over here and you can see these are the grooves that I actually attached my slide hammer to, that 3-jaw puller. No, I take it back, it's these shiny ones right here. But that's what you're going to want to grab onto. You get all 3 jaws on there, give it a good yank. This is the thing that you're fighting right here. It's a little C-clip. And you're going to want to make sure that that comes out with this drive shaft. Obviously, all this stuff is included with our new one. And this guy looks pretty good, so we're going to put it in. So, now we're looking at the transmission again. Now, you may want to replace that seal if you were leaking before. Now, we weren't leaking, so we're just going to leave that guy in there. And we're going to take our new axle, slide it in nice and carefully as to not damage that seal. And then when you have it nice and lined up and flat, we're going to leave this nut on the end here so we don't mess up the threads. And we're just going to tap it really lightly so that it seats itself in the transmission. So next, basically, we're just going to do the reverse of everything we did before. So make sure you line up your backing plate. And then you're going to want to add your hub assembly. Sorry for the same piece there. Yeah, line up the hub assembly, make sure all 4 bolt holes line up, tighten everything here from behind. Then you'll be able to slip this in. Then we're going to get these top 2, put this back in, basically the reverse of everything we've done before. Alright, everything is tightened up. We have our backing plate on. We have just enough room to slide this in, which gives us enough room to lift this up and get our strut into place. Now with our strut into place, we can feed our bolts through. Might have to wiggle this one around a bit, and then we tighten everything up. So now that we got our top mounts on, and these guys are nice and in place, we're going to put our rotor back together. Real easy. We're going to slide our brakes on, get our 2 mounting bolts for the brakes on nice and tight. Then we're going to torque this down with the torque wrench and put the wheel on. Our last step, we're going to use this torque wrench to torque down this axle nut here to 96 foot-pounds. Then we're going to slap that little castle nut on there, throw the cotter pin through, throw the wheel back on, torque those lug nuts to about 83 foot-pounds. Then we'll be ready to drive away. The final step here is to actually add transmission fluid to this thing. Now the port that you add it to, it is buried under here. It is damn near impossible to see. But there is a little fill plug down there. So you're going to pull the fill plug, you're going to take a long skinny funnel, and there's kind of a process to do this. I'm not going to go into too much detail because I'm running out of time on this video. But once you're filled up, you should be good to go. Hope you enjoyed watching. We'll catch you on the next one.